Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The scent of roasting boar and spiced wine was a thick, cloying blanket in the great hall, meant to soothe old tensions and forge new loyalties under the reign of the Alpha King. Laughter, sharp and loud, echoed off the stone walls and ancient timber rafters. Torches spat embers into the smoky air, casting long, dancing shadows that hid secrets in the corners. From her place near the edge of the throng, Brenna Case watched it all, a ghost at her own king's feast. She was a silent observer, an Omega whose quiet presence was as natural and as overlooked as the moss on the northern walls. The bond in her chest, a low, constant hum that had sung since the day Orvin Blackridge had first looked at her and seen his other half, was the only warmth she possessed. It was a secret melody only they could hear, a silent promise that tethered her soul to his. Then he crossed the hall. He moved with the predatory grace that made warriors tremble, and Omega's flush, a living embodiment of power. The crowd parted for him like a river cleaving around a great stone. His eyes, the color of a storm-darkened forest, were not on her. They were fixed on Israpel, an Omega whose laughter was like chimes and whose scent was a sweet, deliberate perfume of night-blooming jasmine. He reached her, and the world seemed to slow, the air thinning until Brenna could barely draw a breath. Orvin smiled, a rare, unguarded thing that he never showed his court, and placed his hand on the curve of Ezra's waist. It was an open gesture, a public claim, a choice made before the eyes of the entire Blackridge pack. Inside Brenna's chest, the humming melody of the bond stuttered. It struck a discordant, agonizing note. Then it began to unravel, thread by painful thread. She watched his thumb stroke Ezra's side, a casual intimacy that was a hammer blow to her own heart. She saw Ezra lean into him, her head tipping back in triumph, her scent blooming with possessive pride. And in that moment, Brenna understood. The secret melody was a song he no longer wished to hear. She felt no fire of rage, no cold wave of tears. There was only a profound and terrifying stillness, a hollow quiet where the song had been. He had made his choice, so she would make hers. She didn't shout, she didn't run, she simply gathered the fraying, broken ends of the bond within herself, cradling the remnants of what had been her life's entire meaning. With a grace no one had ever bothered to notice, she turned her back on the celebration, on her king, on her mate. Her soft-soled boots made no sound on the stone floor as she slipped through the shadows and out of the great hall, disappearing into the cold, indifferent night. The weight of his absence was a burden she had unknowingly carried for months. The weight of her own was a gift she was about to give him. Orvin was laughing at something Ezra had whispered, her breath warm against his ear when the first tremor hit. It wasn't in the earth beneath his feet, but in the earth of his own soul. A sudden violent shudder, as if a foundation stone had been ripped from beneath him. He stumbled, his hand tightening reflexively on Ezra's waist to steady himself. "My king?" she asked, her voice laced with a pretty, feigned concern. He ignored her. The laughter in the hall was suddenly muffled, distant. A cold sweat broke on his brow. The immense, ever-present power of his wolf, a creature of shadow and fury that lived within him, the source of his authority, his strength, his very being, whimpered. It was a sound he had never heard, a pathetic, wounded cry that echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of his own mind. "What is it?" his beta Joran demanded, appearing at his side. Joran's face was a mask of concern, his eyes scanning the crowd for a threat. But the threat wasn't in the room. It was inside him. A second wave of nausea and weakness washed over Orvin, so profound it buckled his knees. He felt his connection to the pack. That intricate web of dominance and loyalty he commanded, flicker like a dying candle. The strength was draining from his limbs, siphoning out of him into an unseen void. "Brenna," he rasped, the name a shard of glass in his throat. His eyes, wild and frantic, scanned the hall. He searched for her quiet corner, for the sight of her dark hair and the simple gray dress she always wore. She wasn't there. The bond that he had taken for granted, that hummed so softly in the background of his life, he had almost forgotten its constant, unwavering presence. It was silent, not just quiet. It was gone. A gaping, bleeding wound had been torn in its place, and his very life force was pouring out of it. He shoved Isra away from him. Her jasmine scent, which had been so alluring moments before, now choked him, thick and foul. "Where is she?" he roared. The voice that came out was not the voice of the Alpha King. It was thin, ragged, laced with a terror he had never known. The pack fell silent. The music died. All eyes were on their king, who was swaying on his feet, his face pale as bone in the torchlight. "Who, my king?" Joran asked, his hand on Orvan's arm, trying to support him. "Brenne," Orvan snarled, ripping his arm away. He pushed through the stunned crowd, his movements clumsy, desperate. He called her name in his mind, screaming it across the mental link they shared. "Brenna." There was no answer, only a dead, hollow echo, like shouting into an empty tomb. The scent. He needed her scent. He cast about his senses, now dull and failing, searching for her unique fragrance of wild heather and clean rain on stone. He caught a phantom trace of it near the great doors. A ghost of a memory. She had been here. And now she was gone. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just slighted her. He hadn't just chosen another. He had shattered the most sacred law of their kind, desecrating the bond the moon goddess herself had bestowed. He had taken his other half, the anchor of his soul, and publicly, brutally cast her aside. And she had simply accepted it. She had left. A guttural cry of pure agony tore from his throat. He burst through the heavy oak doors and into the freezing night air. The silver moon hung in the sky, a cold, judgmental eye watching his undoing. He saw them then, the faint impressions of her boots in the thin layer of frost on the path leading toward the forest. His wolf surged, not with power, but with raw, animal panic. It clawed at the inside of his chest, desperate to give chase, to find its missing half. He ran, his powerful legs eating up the ground, his labored breaths clouding in the frigid air. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of black pines and ancient secrets. The faint trail of her scent was his only guide, a fading breadcrumb trail leading him away from his throne and toward his ruin. He ran until his lungs burned and his weakened muscles screamed in protest. He followed the whisper of heather and rain through the dark, tangled woods, pushing past low-hanging branches that whipped at his face. The bond wasn't just broken, it felt like a vital organ had been surgically removed without anesthetic. Every step was agony. Every breath was a testament to the cavernous void she had left behind. He finally burst into a clearing at the edge of his territory, marked by a line of ancient, rune-carved stones that pulsed with faint magic. He stopped, his chest heaving. Her scent ended here. It didn't fade, it didn't dissipate. It simply stopped, as if she had stepped off the edge of the world. She had crossed the border. She had left Blackridge lands. She had willingly, deliberately, walked out of his life and severed the final physical tether between them. The cold that seeped into him had nothing to do with the night air. It was a deathly chill that came from the very core of his being. The Alpha King, the great Orvan Blackridge, who had conquered rival packs and commanded the loyalty of thousands, stood alone in a moonlit clearing, utterly and completely broken. He threw his head back, and the sound that erupted from his soul was not a howl of dominance or a call to his pack. It was a raw, discordant scream of pure, undiluted loss, a sound of a soul being ripped in two. It tore through the silent forest, shaking the very leaves on the trees, a desperate, hopeless cry for the part of him that was now gone. "Bren," he roared to the mocking moon, his voice cracking with despair. The forest gave no answer but the echo of his own desolation. The moment Bren stepped over the border, the last, thinnest filament of the bond connecting her to Orvan snapped. It wasn't a gentle fraying. It was a violent, soundless recoil, like a silver cord stretched to its breaking point finally giving way. The backlash slammed into her. a wave of nauseating emptiness that stole the air from her lungs. For a dizzying second, the world went gray. The vibrant colors of the forest floor muted. The scent of pine and frozen earth turned to ash in her nose. The constant humming presence that had been the background music of her entire adult life was gone. The silence it left behind was absolute, a profound and terrifying void. Her wolf, a timid creature she had rarely felt since she'd presented as an Omega, whimpered deep within her. It was a faint, threadbare echo, confused and aching from the sudden amputation. She pressed a hand to her sternum, half expecting to feel a physical wound. The skin was cold, the fabric of her dress coarse against her trembling fingers, but the agony was deeper, woven into the marrow of her bones. He was gone. The part of her that was his was gone. A raw, hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up her throat, but she choked it down. What a fool she'd been. To think that the secret glances, the fleeting moments his gaze had softened when he thought no one was looking, had meant something more than fleeting curiosity. He was a king. Kings did not mate with quiet, unremarkable Omegas who blended into the stonework. They chose partners who shone, who commanded attention, who could stand beside them in the firelight and look like a prize. Isra was a prize. Brenna was a secret. And secrets were burdens to be discarded. The cold was a physical shock, seeping through her thin dress and worn boots. She had left with nothing but the clothes on her back, no food, no cloak, no plan. There was only the primal, desperate instinct to run, to put as much distance as possible between her and the source of her annihilation before the pain paralyzed her completely. She plunged deeper into the neutral lands, the whispers of the pines replacing the echoes of laughter from the great hall. The trees here were older, their branches heavier with snow, their trunks twisted into gnarled shapes that seemed to watch her with ancient malice. This was untamed territory, home to rogues, wild beasts, and shifters who answered to no alpha. For an Omega alone, it was a death sentence. But staying in Blackridge, watching him build a life with Isra while the bond slowly withered and died inside her, that was a different kind of death. A slower, more humiliating execution. This, at least, was as a choice. Her choice. A twig snapped behind her. Brenny froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She strained her ears, listening past the thrum of her own blood. Was it one of his trackers? Had he sent someone so soon? The thought sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She couldn't be dragged back. She wouldn't be his forgotten mate, a ghost haunting the halls of his court, a constant reminder of his broken vow. She scrambled forward, her movements clumsy with panic, tripping over a gnarled root and sprawling onto the frozen ground. The impact knocked the wind from her, and the sharp edge of a rock sliced through the worn fabric at her knee. A hot, searing pain followed, and the coppery scent of her own blood rose in the frigid air. She pushed herself up, ignoring the sting. The scent would draw predators. She had to keep moving. Limping, she pushed on, deeper and deeper into the suffocating darkness of the forest. The rhythmic drip of her blood onto the dead leaves a terrifying countdown clock. Jorn found his king on his knees at the territorial border, his hands clawed into the frozen earth as if trying to hold the very ground together. Orvin's great shoulders were shaking, and the sounds tearing from his throat were guttural, inhuman expressions of agony. The Alpha King, the Blackridge beast who had never known defeat, was broken. "Orvin!" Joran knelt beside him, his voice low and urgent. He placed a hand on Orvin's shoulder, and the king flinched as if struck. Orvin's head snapped up. His eyes, usually a sharp, intelligent forest green, were bloodshot and wild. The pupils dilated with panic. A thin line of blood trickled from his lip where he'd bitten it. The sheer force of his power, the aura of command that usually radiated from him like heat, was gone. In its place was a brittle, frantic energy, a live wire sparking in the dark. "She's gone," Orvin rasped, his voice raw. "Joran, she left. She crossed the border." Joran's face hardened. He had seen the quiet Omega Brenna slip from the hall. He had seen the moment the life seemed to drain from his alpha's face. He understood. "We'll get her back." "You don't understand," Orvin choked out, staggering to his feet. He swayed, and Joran had to steady him. The king's body, a fortress of muscle and bone, felt strangely light, hollowed out. She took it with her, the bond, all of it. She didn't just leave it to break. She withdrew it. She took my strength with her. Joran's blood ran cold. Such a thing was unheard of, a legend whispered by the oldest pack members. A mate bond was a divine gift, but also a conduit. For an Alpha King, it was the anchor for the immense power required to rule. For the Omega half of that bond to not just reject it, but to actively pull it back, to reclaim the energy she had given. It was an act of unimaginable will, and it would cripple the Alpha left behind. "We have to go back," Joran said, his voice firm, forcing strength into his tone for both their sakes. "The pack saw your weakness. They are like sharks smelling blood. You must stand before them. You must give the order." Orvin looked back at the great hall, its lights a distant, mocking glow. The thought of facing them, of facing Isra, filled him with a self-loathing so profound it was a physical sickness. He had done this. In a moment of arrogant carelessness, he had shattered his own foundation. He had held a goddess's gift in his hands and treated it like a common stone, tossing it aside for a glittering piece of glass. He let Joran guide him back through the woods. Every step was a battle. His senses were dull, his hearing muffled. The familiar sense of his own territory were faint, as if he were experiencing the world through a thick veil. He could feel the tether to his wolf fraying, the great beast within him pacing and whining, confused and weakened, severed from its anchor. When they entered the great hall, a wave of silence washed over the room. Every eye was on him. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw something far more dangerous. Calculation. He saw ambitious alphas sizing him up, watching the tremor in his hands, the pallor of his skin. Isra rushed forward, her face a perfect portrait of distress. "My king, you're hurt. What happened?" She reached for his arm, her jasmine scent thick and suffocating. Orvin recoiled from her touch as if from a hot brand. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the alluring Omega he had desired, but the architect of his ruin. His voice when it came was not a roar, but a low, deadly snarl that cut through the hall like black ice. "Do not touch me," he commanded. The words were quiet, but they carried the last vestiges of his authority. Isra froze, her hand hovering in the air, her face falling from concern into shocked humiliation. "You will leave my sight. Now." She paled, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But, my king, now," he repeated, the word a blade. Humiliation warred with fear on her face. With a final venomous glance, she turned and fled the hall, the whispers of the pack following her like biting insects. Orvin drew himself up, leaning on a pride he no longer felt he possessed. He locked eyes with his lead tracker, a grizzled wolf named Falk. "She crossed the northern border," Orvin stated, his voice gaining a fraction of its former strength. "Brenna Kays, find her. Do not harm her. Do not frighten her. Bring her home. Bring me back my mate." The word mate hung in the air, a stunning public confession. It was a confirmation of the rumors, an admission of his monumental failure. Falk nodded, his expression grim. "And if she will not come, Alpha?" Orvin's gaze was chilling. The feral, desperate wolf within him looked out through his eyes. "Then you will tell her that without her, this pack will fall. Without her, her king will die. And I will burn this entire forest to the ground to find her. Now go." Brenna finally found shelter in a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of frozen ivy. It was little more than a hollow in the rock, barely deep enough to shield her from the biting wind. She huddled in the back, wrapping her arms around herself, her body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The throbbing in her knee was a dull, constant ache, a counterpoint to the sharp, gaping wound in her soul. Exhaustion was a heavy blanket pulling her down. She closed her eyes, and his face immediately swam in her vision. Not the king who had dismissed her, but the younger Orvin, before the crown had settled so heavily on his brow. A memory surfaced, so vivid it made her gasp. They were youths, barely presented. A visiting alpha had cornered her, his scent thick with aggression. She had been terrified, frozen. And Orvin, not yet a king, but already powerful, had appeared out of nowhere. He hadn't said a word. He'd simply stood between them, a silent, unmovable wall, and stared the other alpha down until he had backed away, growling in submission. Orvin had glanced back at her then, just for a second, and the bond had flared between them for the first time. a secret, brilliant spark of recognition, of belonging. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Where had that wolf gone? When had he forgotten the spark that had promised her a universe? The snapping of a twig jerked her from her reverie. Her eyes flew open. This sound was different from the furtive noises of forest creatures. It was heavier, closer, deliberate. She held her breath, her senses straining. Her hearing, dulled by the broken bond, could barely pick it up. A soft crunch of snow, the whisper of leather against bark. Someone was outside her shelter. One of his trackers. They had found her. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She couldn't go back. She scrambled deeper into the cave, pressing herself against the damp, freezing rock. A large shadow fell across the opening, blocking the pale moonlight. It was a figure far larger than Falk or any of Orvan's wolves. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, a sound deeper and more menacing than any she had ever heard. It wasn't a sound of her pack. It was the growl of a predator who had found its prey. Slowly the figure stooped, moving into the dim light of the cave. Brenna's breath hitched in her throat. He was massive, clad in dark furs, his face obscured by shadow, but she could see his eyes. They glowed with a faint internal luminescence in the dark. They were not the familiar warm gold of the Blackridge pack. They were the chilling predatory silver of a winter moon, and they were fixed entirely on her. The air in the small cave grew impossibly cold, the rogue's presence a palpable entity that leached the warmth from the stone. Brenna pressed herself back, the rough wall digging into her spine. Her mind screamed run, but her body was frozen, a trapped animal in the face of a predator far greater than any she had known. He took another slow step inside, the faint moonlight from the entrance catching on the harsh planes of his face. It was a face carved from granite and hardship, framed by a mane of untamed silver-streaked dark hair. A jagged scar sliced through one eyebrow and down his cheek, a pale, puckered line that spoke of a battle won at great cost. His silver eyes held hers, and there was no heat in them, no flicker of the possessive fire she sometimes saw in pack alphas. There was only a profound, chilling emptiness, like looking into a winter sky just before a blizzard. His scent filled the small space, overwhelming the familiar smells of earth and damp rock. He smelled of cold stone, of wind whistling through barren mountain peaks, and faintly of old dried blood. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together deep beneath the earth. It was not a question. Brenna's hand instinctively went to her injured knee. The fabric was sticky and cold. The scent of it, her scent, was what had drawn him. She was an idiot, a terrified, wounded, helpless idiot. He took another step and she flinched, a small, involuntary movement. A flicker of something, not pity, but perhaps a cold understanding, passed through his silver gaze. He stopped. "The great king's mate," he murmured, the words laced with a dark, mocking irony. "Lost and broken, far from her golden cage." The words were a slap. How could he know? Rogues were outcasts, cut off from the pack links and gossip. But as she looked at him, truly looked, she saw the faint, shimmering aura of power around him, different from Orvan's but no less potent. He was no common rogue. He was an alpha without a pack, the most dangerous creature in the forest. "I am no one's mate," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was the first time she had said it aloud, and the finality of it was a fresh wound. The rogue tilted his head, a gesture that was unnervingly wolf-like. "No, you reek of him, of pine and arrogance and broken promises. But underneath it, you smell of absence, of a bond torn out by the roots. He broke you." Brenna's breath hitched. To have her deepest, most private agony named so plainly by a stranger was obscene. The last vestiges of her fear were burned away by a sudden, hot surge of defiance. She had nothing left to lose. She had already been publicly cast aside, her soul fractured. What more could this scarred stranger do to her? "You know nothing about me," she said, her voice shaking but clear. He gave a low, humorless chuckle. "I know the look of a wolf who has chewed off its own leg to escape a trap." He took a final step toward her, and she forced herself to stand her ground, to meet his chilling gaze without flinching. He was close enough now that she could feel the cold radiating from him. He knelt, his movements surprisingly fluid for a man of his size. bringing his face level with hers. "The question is, little shadow, what will you do now that you are free and bleeding in a forest full of wolves?" Before she could answer, a new sound cut through the night. A familiar sound, a howl. Not a lone cry, but the call of a hunting party, echoing through the pines. It was Falk's call, Orvan's hunters. They were close. The rogue's head snapped up, his attention fixed on the entrance of the cave. A low, menacing growl vibrated in his chest, a clear warning to the approaching wolves. He looked back at Brenna, and his silver eyes narrowed. "Your king has sent his dogs to fetch you." Panic, sharp and familiar, clawed at her throat again. They would drag her back. Back to the pitying stares, the whispers, back to the suffocating presence of Orvan's new life, a life built on the ruins of hers. "No," she breathed. "I won't go back." The rogue's scarred lip curled in something that might have been a smile. "Then you had best hope you can run faster than they can." He rose and turned just as three figures appeared at the mouth of the cave, their forms silhouetted against the moonlight. The lead wolf, Falk, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of the large knife at his belt. His eyes, the familiar gold of the Blackridge pack, flickered from the massive rogue to Brenna, huddled in the back. "Brenna," Falk said, his voice tight with authority, "the Alpha King commands your return." "She is not going anywhere," the rogue rumbled, positioning himself between Brenna and the trackers. Falk's eyes narrowed on the stranger. "This is pack business, rogue. Stand aside before you get hurt." The rogue laughed, a cold, harsh sound that grated on the nerves. "You and your pups think you can make me?" In the ensuing silence, Brenna could feel the tension coil in the small space. It was a standoff between the disciplined loyalty of the pack and the raw, untamed power of the wild. Falk was strong, one of Orvan's best, but the sheer predatory presence of the silver-eyed rogue made him and his two companions seem like boys playing at war. And in that moment, Brenna felt something shift inside her. A tiny, stolen spark of power. It wasn't the warm, encompassing hum of the mate bond. It was something else, something colder, sharper, and entirely her own. It was the thrill of a choice. Orvan paced the throne room like a caged beast. The weakness was a constant, debilitating sickness. His hands trembled so violently, he had to clench them into fists to still them. A fine sheen of cold sweat covered his skin. He had tried to connect with his wolf, to draw on its strength, but the creature was distant, whimpering in a far corner of his mind, its power inaccessible, severed from its source. The pack elders, three grim-faced wolves with eyes that had seen a dozen alphas rise and fall, stood before him. The oldest, Gerhardt, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and old scars, spoke with a voice like stones tumbling downhill. "The pack is restless, Orvan. They feel your weakness. The territories to the east are being tested by the Stone Creek pack. They smell your infirmity on the wind. You must assert your dominance." "I have sent my best tracker," Orvan snarled, his voice lacking its usual resonance. "She will be brought back." "You speak of the Omega," Gerhardt said, his tone dismissive. "A mate you kept hidden, a bond you dishonored. You broke the sacred law, and now you expect the goddess to simply return what you threw away? This is not a matter of a lost Omega. This is a matter of a failing king. The bond is a gift, but it is also a responsibility. You have proven yourself unworthy of both." Each word was a nail hammered into his pride. He knew they were right. He had been arrogant, a fool blinded by the trivial pursuit of a pretty face and a sweet scent. He had forgotten that Brenna was not just an Omega. She was his other half, the anchor that held his immense power in balance. Without her, he was a ship without a rudder, tossed on a sea of his own uncontrolled energy, which was now draining away into nothing. The bond felt like a phantom limb, an excruciating ache where something vital used to be. He closed his eyes, trying to reach for that phantom connection, to find a single thread of her in the void. For hours there had been nothing but a painful, static silence. But now he felt something, a faint, distant pinprick. It wasn't the warm hum of their bond. It was a spike of pure, undiluted terror. Her terror. And then something else, a scent. Not pine, not heather, cold stone, winter wind, another male, a powerful alpha. The scent was wrapped around the flicker of her fear, possessive and dangerous. A guttural roar of pure primal jealousy ripped from Orvan's throat. It was a sound so full of rage and pain that the elders took an involuntary step back. His vision tunneled, the throne room fading to red. His mate, someone else was near her, touching her, claiming what was his. The rage gave him a momentary fleeting surge of strength. The phantom limb flared with agonizing life. He could feel her 1,000 miles away, her heart pounding. He could smell the rogue's scent on her. He stumbled, gripping the arm of the throne, his knuckles white. "Falk!" he roared, projecting his voice with every last ounce of will he possessed. The mental command, usually so clear and strong, was a ragged, desperate shout. "Report! Who is with her?" He waited, his chest heaving, his world shrinking to that one fragile point of connection. He needed to know. He needed to find her. He needed to rip the throat out of the wolf who dared to touch what belonged to him. In the cave, the standoff broke. Falk, unwilling to fail his alpha, made his move. He lunged, not at the rogue, but toward the side, trying to get past him to Brenna. It was a fatal miscalculation. The rogue moved with impossible speed. One moment he was standing still, the next he was a blur of dark fur and violence. He caught Falk by the front of his tunic, lifting the powerful tracker off his feet as if he weighed nothing, and slammed him against the cave wall. The sound of the impact echoed with a sickening crunch. The other two trackers drew their knives, but froze when the rogue turned his silver-eyed glare on them. A low, deathly growl promising retribution if they took another step. He dropped Falk, who slumped to the ground, groaning and clutching his shoulder. "I will not kill you on your own land," the rogue snarled, his voice dangerously low. "But you will not take her. She does not wish to go." He looked back at Brenna, his expression unreadable. The choice is hers. All eyes fell on her. Falk pushing himself up, his face a mask of pain and fury. His two stunned trackers, the scarred, silver-eyed alpha. They were all waiting for her. She looked at Falk, a wolf she had known her whole life, and saw only the chains he represented. He was Orvan's will made flesh, sent to drag her back to her gilded cage of shame and heartbreak. Then she looked at the rogue, a creature of violence and winter, a complete unknown. He offered no safety, no comfort, no promises. He offered only a choice, and that was more than anyone had ever offered her before. Ignoring Falk's desperate, furious call of her name, Brenna took a single, deliberate step. It wasn't toward the cave entrance, back toward the forest she knew. It was a step away from Orvan's men, a step toward the dangerous, silver-eyed stranger. The moment Brenna took that single, definitive step, the atmosphere in the cave crackled with a new, irreversible tension. It was an act of quiet rebellion, more powerful than any shout. She had chosen the unknown over the familiar, the dangerous stranger over the king's law. Falk's face, already pale from pain, contorted with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Brenna, you don't know what you're doing," he snarled, struggling to get to his feet, his arm hanging at an odd angle. "He's a rogue, an animal. You belong with the pack, with your alpha." "He is not my alpha," Brenna said, and the words, once so painful, now held a sliver of cold, hard freedom. She kept her eyes locked on the silver-eyed rogue, who had not moved, had not even seemed to breathe. He was watching her, his gaze intense, assessing. He was waiting to see if her choice was born of fear or of will. "You're a Blackridge Omega," one of the other trackers shouted, his voice laced with a panicked urgency. "Your loyalty is to the king." "My loyalty was to my mate," she replied, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "He broke that bond, not I." The rogue finally moved. He turned his head slowly, fixing Falk with a look of chilling finality. "You have your answer. She has chosen. Now leave, before my patience wears thin." The implied threat was absolute. There would be no second warning. Falk, clutching his dislocated shoulder, glared at the rogue, then at Brenna. His eyes filled with a bitter, wounded pride. He knew he was beaten. To fight would mean death for him and his men. He spat on the ground, a gesture of profound disrespect. "The king will hear of this," he growled, a promise and a curse. "He will hunt you to the ends of the earth, rogue. And you," he said, his gaze landing on Brenna with venomous contempt, "you will regret this betrayal." With that, he and his trackers backed out of the cave, their movements wary. their eyes never leaving the massive, silent figure who stood guard. Their footsteps crunched in the snow, fading into the night, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than before. Brenna was alone with him. The realization sent a fresh tremor of fear through her, but it was different now. It was no longer the terror of a victim, but the sharp, electric apprehension of someone who has just stepped off a cliff and is waiting to see if she will fly or fall. The rogue turned back to her. The raw violence he had displayed moments before was gone, replaced by that unnerving, watchful stillness. "They will be back," he stated, his voice a low rumble, "and they will bring more than 3 pups next time." "I know," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment, his silver eyes seeming to strip away every pretense, every layer of fear and pain, until he was looking at the raw core of her. "My name is Rain." He offered his name like a stone, a hard, simple fact. It demanded nothing in return. "Brenna," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Brenna," he repeated, tasting the sound of it. He gestured with his head toward the deeper forest, the lands that fell away from Blackridge territory. "My territory is in the mountains, a day's walk from here. You will be safer there. Orvin Blackridge's power wanes beyond the tree line." It wasn't an invitation, not really. It was a statement of the obvious. Her only option. Staying here meant being found, and being found meant being dragged back. She gave a single jerky nod. The throbbing in her knee, forgotten in the adrenaline of the confrontation, returned with a vengeance. She took a tentative step, and a sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips. She faltered, her leg threatening to buckle. Before she could fall, Rain was there. He moved with that same impossible, predatory grace, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. His large hands closed around her upper arms, steadying her. His touch was not gentle, but it was firm, certain. It sent a jolt through her, a startling mix of cold and heat. Through the thin fabric of her dress, his skin felt like cool stone, yet where his fingers pressed, a strange warmth bloomed, chasing away the deep chill that had settled in her bones. His scent enveloped her, that clean, wild smell of winter peaks and cold air. It was stark and elemental, completely devoid of the cloying sweetness of the court. He looked down at her injured knee, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he ripped a strip of cloth from the bottom of his own tunic. He knelt before her, his movements economical and precise. His large, calloused fingers gently probed the edges of the cut on her knee, his touch surprisingly careful. Brenna flinched, but he didn't stop. He worked with an impersonal efficiency, cleaning the wound with a bit of snow before binding it tightly with the strip of cloth. The simple, practical act of care was so unexpected it left her breathless. Orvin had never touched her with such focus. His touch had always been fleeting, secret, almost accidental. This was different, grounded, real. When he was done, he rose, his silver eyes meeting hers. "Can you walk?" She tested her weight on the leg. The binding gave it support, and the pain was a manageable ache now instead of a sharp, stabbing agony. "I think so." "Good," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We move now. The king's shadow is long, and the sun will rise soon." He started out of the cave without a backward glance, clearly expecting her to follow. Brenna hesitated for only a second, then limped after him, leaving the last vestiges of her old life behind, in that cold, damp shelter. She followed the broad, silent shape of the rogue alpha into the deep, untamed wilderness, trading a king's shadow for the uncertain light of a winter moon. The report came just before dawn. Falk, supported by his men, stumbled into the throne room, his face bruised, his arm in a makeshift sling. Orvin, who had not slept, who had spent the night pacing and wrestling with the growing void inside him, turned on them with the fury of a cornered wolf. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice a ragged edge of sound. Falk flinched but held his ground. He recounted the events in the cave, his voice tight with humiliation and rage. He spoke of the rogue, his impossible speed and strength, his silver eyes, and the scar that marked him. But it was his final words that shattered the last of Orvin's control. "She chose him, my king. She stood with him against us. She turned her back on the pack. On you." A profound, deathly silence filled the throne room. The elders watched, their faces grim stone. Orvin stood perfectly still, but Joran could see the tremor that ran through his entire body. The king's face was a mask of disbelief, which slowly, horribly, curdled into a look of absolute murderous rage. She hadn't just run, she hadn't just been taken, she had chosen. She had chosen a nameless, scarred rogue over him, her king, her mate. The phantom pain of the bond erupted, no longer an ache but a searing, white-hot agony. It was the agony of ultimate betrayal. His wolf, which had been hiding in the ruins of his soul, let out a howl of pure fury. Power, born not of his royal lineage, but of raw animalistic jealousy, surged through him. It was a dark, corrosive energy, nothing like the steady, controlled strength he was used to. It was wild and destructive. He let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the hall, a sound of a king pushed past the brink of sanity. He swept his arm across a nearby table, sending a silver flagon and goblets crashing to the stone floor. "A rogue with silver eyes," Orvin snarled, his own eyes blazing with a terrifying green fire. "I know of only one wolf who fits that description. An outcast, an exile." He turned his burning gaze on Gerhardt. "Rain, the one your father cast out for challenging him." Gerhardt's old eyes widened in dawning horror. "It cannot be. He was exiled to the frozen Maw Mountains. No one returns from there." "He has returned," Orvin bit out, a terrible predatory smile twisting his lips. "And he has stolen what is mine." The sudden volatile surge of power, born of rage, gave him a clarity he hadn't had in hours. The weakness was still there, a gnawing hollowness beneath the fire, but the jealousy was a potent fuel. He would not sit here and crumble. He would not let his pack be picked apart by vultures, while his mate warmed the bed of some mountain savage. He stalked toward the great doors of the throne room, his stride regaining some of its former authority. Joran moved to follow him. "My king, where are you going?" "To hunt," Orvin said, his voice a low, deadly promise. He paused at the door and looked back at his assembled court, at the elders, at his trackers, his eyes sweeping over them all. The power crackling around him was unstable, dangerous, but it was undeniably the power of a king. "Send word to the border patrols. Double them. I want eyes on every path, every trail leading from the north. I want that rogue's head. And I want my mate returned. She is the anchor to this pack's strength. She is the other half of my soul. Whether she comes back willingly or in chains, she will come back." He turned and strode from the hall, leaving a stunned and fearful court in his wake. The king's shadow was indeed long, and now it was moving. Fueled by a lover's betrayal and a monarch's rage, it was sweeping out from his castle, intent on swallowing the wilderness whole and reclaiming the one thing that could save him or destroy them all. The journey into the mountains was a brutal education in survival. Rain moved with a relentless, ground-eating pace that Brenna, with her injured knee and court-softened body, struggled to match. He didn't offer words of comfort or pause to ask if she was tired. He simply moved, a force of nature navigating the harsh, unforgiving terrain as if he were born of it. He led them up steep, winding paths of loose scree, through dense thickets of thorned bushes that tore at Bren's simple dress, and across narrow ledges with dizzying drops. The air grew thinner, colder, the scent of pine giving way to the sharp, clean smell of stone and ice. The world of Blackridge, with its torchlit halls and political whispers, felt a lifetime away. Here, the only concerns were the next foothold, the bite of the wind, and the silent, imposing presence of the alpha leading her deeper into the wild. He was not unkind, but he was not kind either. He was practical. When they stopped to rest, it was brief. He would find a sheltered spot out of the wind, produce a strip of dried meat from a pouch at his belt, and hand her half without a word. He showed her how to find a plant with broad, waxy leaves, crush them in her hands, and apply the pulp to her chafed skin to soothe the burn. He moved with a quiet competence, a man utterly at home in a world that would have killed her within a day had she been alone. Brenna watched him, studying him in the silent moments. He was a creature of contrasts. The brutal strength he'd shown in the cave was belied by the careful way his large hands could set a snare or find the driest tinder under a snow-covered log. His silence was not empty. It was watchful, attentive. He was constantly scanning their surroundings, his head tilted, tasting the wind, his silver eyes missing nothing. He was a wolf in the truest sense of the word, and she was a domesticated animal, just learning the laws of the forest. On the second night, a blizzard descended upon them with terrifying speed. The wind howled like a hungry beast, driving sheets of blinding snow before it. Rain found them shelter in the lee of a massive rock overhang, little more than a scoop out of the mountainside. He built a small, controlled fire that gave off more heat than smoke, its flames casting dancing shadows against the stone. Brenna huddled close to the warmth, her body shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. The cold had seeped deep into her bones, a damp, pervasive chill that no fire could seem to touch. Rain sat across from her, seemingly immune to the cold, a stoic, unmoving silhouette against the flickering light. "You are not made for this life," he observed, his voice a low rumble beneath the shriek of the wind. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "No," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I am not." He looked at her, his silver eyes reflecting the firelight. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond that cold, guarded emptiness. It wasn't pity, it was something deeper, a kind of weary recognition. "He kept you like a songbird in a cage," Rain murmured. "Heard your song when he wished, but never taught you how to fly." He shifted, reaching into his pack. He pulled out a heavy, worn fur pelt, the coat of some great northern bear, thick and dark. He tossed it to her. It landed across her lap, heavy and smelling faintly of him, of winter and cold stone and wild freedom. Brenna stared at it, then up at him. "You'll be cold." A humorless smile touched his lips. "The cold and I are old companions." She hesitated, then wrapped the heavy fur around her shoulders. The immediate warmth was a blissful shock. It was more than just the heat of the fur. It felt as if it held a remnant of his own body heat, a stoic, steady warmth that sank through her clothes and began to chase away the deep internal chill. She buried her face in the thick pelt, inhaling his scent. It should have been foreign, alarming. Instead, it was grounding. It was the scent of survival. She fell into a fitful, exhausted sleep, the howl of the wind her lullaby, the scent of the rogue her only comfort. She dreamed of Orvin. She saw him as he'd been at the feast, his hand on Isra's waist, his smile a beacon of betrayal. Then the image shifted. He was roaring her name in the throne room, his face a mask of fury, his eyes blazing with a possessive fire she had never seen directed at her. She felt a phantom tug, a ghost of the bond, tainted now with rage and jealousy. "Mine," it seemed to echo across the distance. "You are mine." She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding. The fire was low embers and the blizzard had passed. Rain was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Had he abandoned her? But the heavy fur was still wrapped around her shoulders, and his pack was still by the fire pit. Then she heard it, a soft sound from the edge of the overhang. She rose, pulling the pelt tighter around her, and moved to the edge. The world was blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of fresh snow. The moon was a sharp crescent in a sky full of stars, and the air was so cold it felt crystalline. Rain stood at the edge of the precipice, looking out over the moonlit, snow-covered peaks that stretched to the horizon. He was shirtless, his back to her. His skin seemed to gleam in the moonlight, and the corded muscles of his back and shoulders were a testament to a life of hardship and battle. A tapestry of old scars crisscrossed his skin, pale lines that told a story of survival she couldn't begin to read. He was not admiring the view. His head was bowed, his shoulders tight with a tension that was almost painful to witness. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a noise of profound, private agony. As she watched, a tremor ran through his powerful frame. He was fighting something, a battle waged not with claws and teeth, but within the confines of his own skin. His wolf. He was fighting his own wolf. She had seen pack wolves struggle for dominance, but this was different. This was a war of control, an alpha wrestling his own primal nature into submission. It was raw, and it was terrible. Instinct told her to retreat, to give him his privacy, but something else, a flicker of empathy for this broken, powerful man, held her in place. He was in exile, alone as she was. He must have sensed her presence. He went still, the tension in his shoulders tightening for a moment before he seemed to force it down. Slowly, he turned to face her. In the stark moonlight, the scar on his face was a livid slash. His silver eyes were haunted, filled with a bleakness that stole her breath. "You should not see this," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "What is it?" she whispered, taking a hesitant step toward him. He looked away from her, back toward the mountains. A curse, the price of my freedom. He finally met her gaze again, and the vulnerability she saw there was more shocking than any display of strength had been. My father, the alpha who exiled me, did not just cast me out. He bound my wolf. It is a prisoner inside me, Brenne, always fighting, always raging, to be free. It is a constant battle not to lose myself to it. The confession hung in the frozen air between them. An alpha whose wolf was a prisoner, a king whose power was anchored to a bond he himself had shattered. They were two sides of the same broken coin. She finally understood the coldness in his eyes, the iron control. It was a cage, built to contain the beast within. Without thinking, driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she closed the distance between them. She reached out a trembling hand and gently laid it on his bare arm. His skin was cold, as she'd expected, but the muscles beneath were coiled tight like steel cables. He flinched at her touch, but didn't pull away. He stared down at her small hand on his scarred arm, his expression unreadable. "You are not alone in your prison, Rain," she whispered. His silver eyes lifted to meet hers, and in their depths, she saw the flicker of his caged wolf, a flash of wild, desperate silver, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She saw not a monster, but a survivor. A distant howl echoed up from the valleys below. Orvan's hunters. The sound was closer than before, more determined. The king's shadow was catching up. Rain's gaze sharpened, the moment of vulnerability gone, replaced by the grim focus of a warrior. He looked from the direction of the howl back to her, his expression hardening. "He will not stop." "I know," she said, her hand still resting on his arm. "He believes you are his possession to be reclaimed," Rain said, his voice flat. "He will destroy anything that stands in his way." He looked down at her hand, and then his gaze moved to her face, searching her eyes. "And you, what do you believe you are, Brenne Case?" The question hung between them, more important than the threat of the approaching pack. Was she a possession, a victim, a runaway mate? Or was she something else entirely? The scent of Orvan's betrayal, the memory of his public humiliation of her, rose in her mind, and with it came a cold, clarifying anger. "I am free," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. She squeezed his arm gently, a silent promise. "And I will not be caged again." Rain's territory began abruptly, marked not by rune-carved stones, but by a sudden, dramatic shift in the landscape. The tangled forests and gentle slopes of Blackridge lands gave way to the brutal, vertical world of the frozen maw. Razor-backed ridges sliced into the sky, and ancient gnarled pines clung to sheer rock faces, their roots like grasping claws. The air was thin and bitingly cold, carrying the lonely cry of eagles. This was a land that did not welcome life. It endured it. Rain's den was not a den at all, but a network of caves carved high into the face of a cliff, accessible only by a narrow, treacherous path that was all but invisible from below. The main cavern was surprisingly large, the stone walls smoothed by centuries of wind and water. It was stark and Spartan. Furs were piled in one corner for a bed. A fire pit occupied the center, and a collection of hunting tools and dried herbs were arranged with meticulous order along one wall. There were no comforts, no decorations. It was a place of pure function, the home of a wolf who expected nothing from the world but survival. For days, a tense quiet settled between them. Rain was a constant, silent presence. He would leave before dawn to hunt or patrol the borders of his desolate kingdom, always returning with food, a mountain hare, a brace of hardy birds. He taught her, through action rather than words, how to stitch leather with a bone needle, how to identify the edible roots that grew in the crevices of the rocks, how to read the subtle signs of changing weather in the clouds. He was giving her the tools to survive, to become something other than the helpless Omega she had been. Brenna, in turn, brought a subtle change to the bleak cavern. She swept the floors with a makeshift broom of pine boughs. She found a vein of colored clay and painted simple, spiraling patterns on the cave walls, images of stars and leaves that softened the harshness of the stone. She learned to brew a hot, pungent tea from the herbs he collected, a warmth that fought the constant chill. She didn't speak of Orvan, and he didn't ask. The past was a ghost that haunted the space between them, acknowledged but unnamed. One evening, as Brenna was mending a tear in the bear pelt he had given her, she felt it. A sharp, violent pull in the center of her chest. a phantom echo of the bond. It was stronger than ever before, a desperate, angry summons. It was followed by a wave of pure, undiluted rage that was not her own. She gasped, dropping the needle, her hand flying to her heart. Rain, who had been sharpening a hunting knife by the fire, went utterly still. His silver eyes locked on her, instantly alert. "What is it?" "Him," she breathed, the word torn from her. "He's close. Closer than before." She could feel his fury like a physical force, a storm gathering just beyond the mountains. He was no longer just hunting, he was invading. Rain rose to his feet in one fluid motion, the knife still in his hand. He moved to the mouth of the cave, peering down into the shadowed valleys below. His trackers have been probing the lower passes for days, but this is different. You feel the alpha himself. Brenna nodded, her body trembling. The phantom bond was a poisoned tether, and Orvin was yanking on the leash, reminding her that no matter how far she ran, a part of her was still tied to him. She could feel his frustration, his wounded pride, his absolute refusal to be denied. "He will not be able to follow the path up here," Rain said, his voice a low growl. "Not without a guide, but he will send his best. They will try to scale the cliffs." The thought of Orvin's warriors swarming their sanctuary sent a fresh wave of fear through her. This place, this stark and lonely cave, had become a fragile haven. Rain had given her a choice, and now Orvin was coming to rip it away. "He doesn't just want me back," Brenna whispered, the terrible truth finally coalescing. "He needs me back. The bond, he's weak without it." Gerhardt the Elder said the pack was growing restless. Rain turned from the entrance, his face a mask of stone in the firelight. "So you are not just his runaway mate. You are his power, his crown, and he has come to reclaim his property." The words were flat, but she heard the undertone of contempt. "I am not his property," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce anger. "Then prove it," Rain challenged, his silver eyes boring into hers. "When his warriors come, will you hide behind me, or will you be the wolf that chewed off her own leg to be free?" His words were a lash, stinging her pride. He was right. Hiding had been her life's occupation, hiding in the corners of the great hall, hiding her feelings, hiding her pain. She had made one choice in that cave, but now she had to live it. That night she couldn't sleep. The angry thrumming from Orvin's direction was a constant, maddening pressure in her mind. She left the warmth of the fire and the furs, and walked to the mouth of the cave. The moon was full, a perfect silver disk that bathed the jagged peaks in an ethereal, ghostly light. The world was silent, beautiful, and terrifying. She thought of the two alphas, Orvin, a king defined by his pack, his power external, drawn from his bond and the loyalty of his subjects. Without them, he was diminished, a fallen star. And Rain, an alpha defined by his isolation, his power internal, a caged beast he fought every moment to control. One was a king of wolves, the other was simply a wolf. Standing there on the edge of the world, she felt the last of her old self fall away. She was not Brenna Case of the Blackridge Pack. She was not Orvin's broken mate. She was just Brenna, a survivor. From the darkness behind her, Rain spoke, his voice quiet. "The moon calls to them. It makes them stronger. They will come at dawn." She didn't turn. "What will we do?" "I will face them," he said simply, as if stating he would fetch water. "They will kill you," she said, her voice tight. "There will be too many." He came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, grounding weight in the vast emptiness of the night. He followed her gaze to the full moon, a muscle feathered in his jaw. "My wolf has not felt the full moon in 20 years, not since the binding." The agony in that simple statement struck her to the core. To be a shifter, a creature of the moon, and to be denied its power, to have its call be a source of pain instead of strength. It was a cruelty beyond imagining. An idea, wild and reckless, sparked in her mind. It was born of desperation and a strange, fierce desire to protect this broken man who had protected her. "The binding," she said, turning to him. "What is it? A spell?" Rain looked down at her, his expression guarded. "An ancient curse, woven with blood magic by a pack elder. It shackles my wolf to my human form. To try and break it, the pain is..." He trailed off, his eyes turning back to the moon. a bleak landscape of memory in their depths. You said my bond was an anchor for Orvan's power, she pressed, the idea taking shape, terrifying and exhilarating. A conduit. What if it could be a conduit for something else? For you? He stared at her, his silver eyes widening slightly in shock. What are you saying? I don't know, she admitted, her heart hammering. But the bond is not just gone. I withdrew it. I am holding it. It's a spark, Rain, a stolen spark of an alpha's power. What if I could give it to you, not to bind you to me, but to lend you its strength, to help you break the curse? It was madness, an omega the weakest of their kind, offering to channel a king's power into an exiled alpha. It defied every law of their nature. Rain looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. The stoic mask was gone, replaced by a raw, naked astonishment. That would be incredibly dangerous. For you, if the power is too much, it could destroy you, burn you out from the inside. Orvan's men are coming at dawn, she replied, her voice steady. That seems more dangerous. She looked up at the moon, then back at him. You saved me. Let me try to save you. For a long, breathless moment, he was silent. He searched her face, looking for fear, for hesitation. He found only a quiet, resolute determination. He had challenged her to be a wolf, and she was answering. Slowly, he gave a single nod. The binding is centered here, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. He touched a spot over his heart. It is a knot of cold magic. To break it, the power must be absolute. She took a deep breath. Then let's give it a fight. She reached up, her trembling hands cupping his face, her thumbs resting on the harsh line of his cheekbones. He was cold, like stone, but he did not pull away. She closed her eyes, turning her focus inward. She sought the place where her bond with Orvan had once lived. It was a scarred, hollowed-out space, but in the center of it, she found what she was looking for, a tiny, fiercely burning ember. It was the remnant of the bond, the power she had reclaimed. It was hers, with a will she didn't know she possessed. She focused on that ember, fanning it, feeding it with her own life force, her anger, her desperate hope. It grew from a spark to a flame, a ball of raw, untamed alpha power humming in her chest. It hurt. It felt like holding a star. Rain, she whispered, her eyes still closed. Let it in. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. At the point of contact, she released the power. It surged from her, a torrent of white-hot energy, not of a king's making, but of an omega's will. It was the power of a shattered bond, reforged into a weapon. It flowed into him, and Rain cried out, a raw, agonized sound as two opposing magics met within his soul. It was the sound of a howl, 20 years silent, finally breaking free. The instant the power left her, Ren collapsed. The strength drained from her limbs, and the world dissolved into a gray, featureless void. She was vaguely aware of Rain catching her before she hit the stone, his arms like iron bands around her. The last thing she heard was her own name, roared in a voice that was no longer just his, but something deeper, doubled, a harmony of man and beast. She drifted in a sea of disjointed sensations, the feeling of being carried, the scent of pine and ozone, the smell of a storm breaking, the distant echoing sound of howls, some familiar and enraged, others wild and triumphant. She felt a phantom agony in her chest, the hollow space where the stolen spark had been, now aching with a profound, echoing emptiness. She had given it all away. When she finally surfaced, it was to the gentle warmth of the fire on her skin and the heavy weight of the fur pelt over her. The cave was quiet. She pushed herself up on trembling elbows, her body feeling fragile, as if made of glass. The fight was over. The sun was high in the sky, its light pouring into the cavern, painting the opposite wall in gold. Rain sat by the fire, his back to her. He was shirtless again, and in the bright light of day, she could see the tracery of scars that covered his skin more clearly. He was utterly still, but it was a different kind of stillness than before. The coiled, brutal tension was gone. This was the placid stillness of a deep river after a storm. Rain, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He turned his head slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. His eyes. They were still silver, but they were no longer the flat, cold silver of a winter sky. They were now the color of molten moonlight, alive with a fierce, burning light. The caged wolf was looking out, not as a prisoner, but as a partner. The two halves of his soul were no longer at war. He rose and came to her, kneeling by the firs where she lay. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His touch, which had always felt like cool stone, was now warm, the heat of a living, breathing alpha, whole and unbound. "They came at dawn," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble, the grinding rocks smoothed into a deep, powerful cadence. 10 of Orvan's best, the king's royal guard. "What happened?" she asked, though she could guess. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips, a true smile that reached his luminous eyes. They were expecting to fight a man. Instead, they met a wolf who had not tasted blood in 20 years. He paused, the memory of the battle flashing in his gaze. "They are gone. They will not be returning." The finality in his tone left no doubt. He had not just defeated them. He had annihilated them. He had unleashed 2 decades of pent-up fury and power on the men who had come to cage her again. "And you?" she asked, her gaze searching his face, his arms for any sign of injury. "I am whole," he said, the word filled with a sense of wonder, as if he were saying it for the first time. He looked down at his own hands, flexing them, marveling at the power that now flowed freely through him. He looked back at her, and the intensity in his molten silver eyes was staggering. "Because of you, you gave me back the moon, Brenna." The gratitude, the raw emotion in his voice, was overwhelming. Tears pricked her eyes. She, the quiet Omega, the overlooked shadow, had freed a cursed alpha. She had done something that mattered. But the cost. The aching void in her chest was a constant reminder. She had severed the last ghostly tie to Orvan, but in doing so, she had emptied herself. As if he could read her thoughts, Rain's expression softened. "The power you gave me, it did not vanish. It settled the war inside me. It joined the 2 halves of my soul, but it is still there, Brenna. A part of you, woven into me now." He reached out, his hand hovering over her chest, not touching, but she could feel the heat radiating from his palm. "And I feel what you feel, the emptiness, the cost." "It was a price worth paying," she whispered. "It was a debt," he corrected softly. "And it is one I intend to repay." He leaned closer, his scent enveloping her, no longer just of cold stone, but of living earth, of pine, of the wild, free mountains. He was so close she could see the flecks of darker silver in his eyes, the faint lines around them. The world seemed to shrink to the space between their faces. "When you gave me that power," he murmured, his voice dropping to a husky whisper, "you didn't just break my curse. You created something new, a connection, not a bond forced by destiny, but one forged in fire and choice." He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers, just as she had done. But this time, instead of giving, she was receiving. A gentle, steady warmth flowed from him into her. It was not the searing, volatile power of an alpha king, but something else entirely. It was the strength of the mountains, the resilience of the ancient pines, the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a lone wolf who had found his pack in a single person. It poured into the aching void within her, not filling it with a foreign energy, but nourishing what was already there, helping her own small, timid wolf awaken and heal. It was not a mate bond. It was something deeper, something chosen. His lips found hers. The kiss was not rough or demanding, but a slow, deliberate claiming. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared survival, of 2 broken souls finding their missing pieces in the most unlikely of places. It tasted of the wild, of freedom, of a future she had never dared to imagine. When he finally pulled back, her heart was hammering, but the desperate emptiness in her chest had been replaced by a quiet, steady glow, her own, warmed and strengthened by his. "I was in exile," he said, his silver eyes holding hers, making a silent vow. "A king without a kingdom. You are a queen without a crown. This is our territory now, together." But as he spoke, a new sensation pricked at the edges of Brenna's consciousness, a cold, familiar dread. From the south, from the direction of Blackridge, she felt a seismic shift. a tearing, agonizing snap that echoed in the very bones of the world. It was the final, complete shattering of the bond she had once shared with Orvin. But it wasn't her doing this time. It was the bond breaking from his end. A bond could not survive the death of one of its pair. Orvin was dead. The thought should have brought relief or closure. Instead, it brought a chilling premonition. An Alpha King did not simply die. The power he held, the divine right of the Blackridge line, did not just vanish. It had to go somewhere. Rain felt it too. He stiffened, rising to his feet and moving to the mouth of the cave. He stared south, a grim, hard line to his jaw. The king has fallen. How? Brenna asked, joining him, pulling the fur tight around her shoulders. He poured all of his failing strength, all of his rage, into his royal guard, Rain said, his voice low and dangerous. When I destroyed them, I destroyed the last vestiges of his power. His pack would have felt the final severance. A rival would have challenged him in his weakness, and a king without his anchor cannot win. Below them, in the distance, a new sound rose from the lands of the Blackridge pack. It was not the howl of grief for a fallen king. It was a single, unified howl of fealty, of a pack swearing allegiance to a new alpha. The scent of betrayal, thick and cloying, seemed to drift up on the wind, a memory from a lifetime ago. The sweet, deliberate perfume of night-blooming jasmine. Isra, Brenny breathed, the name tasting like poison. Orvin had not been challenged by a rival alpha. He had been betrayed from within. Isra, with her cunning and ambition, must have aligned with another powerful alpha in the court, perhaps one who had always coveted the throne, and they had struck when Orvin was at his most vulnerable, his power and his elite guard sent away on a fool's errand. The howl from the south rose again, stronger this time, a declaration of a new reign. And in that moment, Brenna felt another presence reaching for her, a new, grasping tendril of a bond, trying to form. The Blackridge alpha power, now in the hands of a usurper, was instinctively seeking its lost anchor. It was a foul, unwelcome touch in her mind, a chain seeking her throat. Rain growled, a low, protective rumble in his chest. He moved to stand in front of her, shielding her with his body, as if he could physically block the intrusive magic. His hand found hers, his fingers lacing with hers, strong and warm. He may be dead, Rain said, his silver eyes blazing with a cold fire as he stared down at the kingdom that had cast him out. But the king's shadow has found a new master, and it will not stop hunting you. 3 winters passed. The snows came and went, blanketing the frozen maw in silent white, then retreating to reveal the hard gray granite and the stubborn green of the pines. The memory of Blackridge, of torchlit halls and broken promises, faded like a bad dream. Brenna no longer flinched at shadows or listened for the sound of hunters in the valley. The grasping tendrils of the usurper's bond had long since withered, unable to find purchase across the vast, desolate territory that Rain's power now commanded. Her hands, once soft and unmarked, were now capable and calloused. She could track a mountain cat, dress a kill, and find her way by the stars. The timid, overlooked Omega was a ghost, replaced by a woman who was as much a part of the mountains as the wind and the stone. Her own small wolf, once a frightened whimper, had found its voice. It was not a roar to command armies, but a quiet, steady presence within her, a song of survival that hummed in harmony with the wild. The cave was no longer a Spartan shelter, but a home. Bright, woven hangings made from dyed grasses and feathers covered the walls. A small garden of hardy herbs thrived in a sunlit corner near the entrance. The scent of roasting meat and brewing tea mingled with the constant, clean smell of pine from the fire. It was a place of warmth and life carved into the heart of the cold stone. One evening, Brenna stood at the precipice, looking out at the vast expanse of their kingdom of 2. The sun was setting, painting the snow-capped peaks in hues of rose and gold. A familiar, powerful warmth pressed against her back, and strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her against a solid chest. Rain rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. He no longer smelled of just winter. He smelled of wood smoke, of her, of home. "The eagles are returning to the high nests," he murmured, his voice a deep, comforting rumble against her spine. "Spring will be early this year." She leaned back into him, her hand covering his where it rested on her stomach. The connection between them was a living thing, a quiet, powerful current that flowed as steadily as the seasons. It was not the frantic, demanding hum of a mate bond, but a deep, resonant chord of choice, of respect, of two souls who had healed each other. "I found a new patch of sunroot on the western slope," she said, her voice content. "Enough to last us through the next winter, even if it comes early." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "You know this mountain better than I do now." "This mountain is in my bones," she replied softly. "Just as you are." They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening indigo sky. Below them, the world was a tapestry of shadow and fading light. She remembered a time when she had been one of those shadows, invisible and lost. Now she stood in the light, seen and cherished. "Do you ever think of them?" she asked quietly, the question surfacing without its old sting. "Of what happened in the south?" Rain was silent for a moment, his gaze turning toward the distant, unseen lands of his birth. News sometimes traveled on the wind, carried by migrating birds or the whispers of rogues who skirted the edges of his territory. They knew that the reign of Isra and her alpha had been short and bloody. A pack ruled by betrayal was a pack built on sand. Faction fought faction, and the strength of the Blackridge name had crumbled into infighting and weakness. The Stone Creek pack had finally overrun their eastern territories, and the great kingdom Orvin had commanded was now a fractured, squabbling shadow of its former glory. "I think," Rain said finally, his voice devoid of triumph or malice, "that a cage, no matter how gilded, is still a cage. They chose theirs, we chose ours." He turned her in his arms, his molten silver eyes, which now held only warmth for her, searching her face. "Do you have any regrets, Brenna?" She looked up at his scarred, beloved face. She thought of the pain, the humiliation, the terror of her flight. She thought of the cold, the hunger, and the fear. And she knew with an unshakable certainty that she would walk through it all again to find her way here, to this moment, to him. "My only regret," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "is that it took me so long to learn how to run." A slow smile spread across his face, the smile of a wolf who was finally at peace. He lowered his head and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss filled with the quiet promises of 1,000 sunsets yet to come. It was a kiss that spoke of shared solitude, of fierce loyalty, and of a love that had been forged not by fate, but by will. Later, as the full moon rose, a perfect, luminous pearl in the black sky, they lay tangled in the firs by the fire. The moonlight streamed into the cave, bathing them in its ethereal glow. For Rain, its call was no longer a curse, but a symphony. His wolf, whole and free, rested contentedly within him, its head on the paws of its human soul. He ran a hand down her side, his touch both gentle and possessive. "The night we met," he murmured against her hair, "I told you that you were a wolf who had chewed off her own leg to escape a trap." She tilted her head back to look at him. "I remember." "I was wrong," he said, his silver eyes filled with a deep, reverent light. "You were not just escaping. You were running toward something. You were running toward the moon." And as he held her, two halves of a howl finally at peace, Brenna knew he was right. She had run from a king's shadow and found a home in an exile's heart. She had traded a broken bond for a chosen soul. Here, high in the frozen peaks, where the moon met the earth, she was not a possession, not an omega, not a prize to be won or lost. She was free, and she was loved.